Thanks for inviting me to share this, Alex. Pickings were pretty poor, so we had to reach back 35 years for this presentation. It was a long time ago, but one of the important moments of my life in aviation. Just a little background, I was flying a Cessna 210 in 1982 when one of my medical colleagues, Ed Esteb, asked if I would like to partner in the building of a LongEZ. Heck yes. The A&P that took care of my 210 and another good friend and patient, Jerry Hansen, had started building their LongEZ 2 years before that. I had helped them do the foam, hot wiring, and was a gopher for the other stuff in the early stages when I could attend any of our routine hangar Saturday morning meetings with donuts and coffee. I had a very busy practice, and I told Ed I'd participate in the building when I could. He agreed, and we began work with one of his patients, Bill Hargis, an A&P who started glassing the tub at his home and garage. A lot of hands went into this build. I spent many wee morning hours and lunch breaks in its construction. Eventually, the airplane was ready for its first flight. I was responsible for the engine installation, the avionics, and the electrical system, and whatever unfinished glassing and extras were needed. I sat in the rear seat of Jerry's EZ for hours of training, and landing from that seat was always interesting. The plane was disassembled and trucked to Brown Field, bordering on Tijuana, Mexico, when our Gillespie Field wouldn't allow taxi tests. After putting it together, I requested a high-speed taxi, and inevitably, this resulted in a first flight. Although I survived, it wasn't without adventure. The radio failed, and I had to use a handheld. The trim was bad, and I needed lots of stick force, no matter the setting. On rolling out, the right brake partially failed, and I went into the dirt between the parallel runways. The dust it created made the waiting guys think I had crashed. I was able to get it back to the apron, but it was exciting. After repairing the avionics and the brakes, and replacing the nose gear, changing the GU canard to a Rance canard, adjusting the main wing incidents for trim, and flying off the 40 hours at Borrego Valley in the desert, it was finally ready. We were very fortunate to have Roman Wasilewski, who was a conveyor engineer, in our group, and he rebuilt our used Lycoming L2C engine, adding F pistons to increase the horsepower from 115 to 130. My buddy Jerry Hansen was aware of the many lies I told about my flying history since age 11 at the Saturday coffees, and he looked up my history, finding this in his archives. There's a very long story leading to the reason for the Ireland flight. No details. But what I can say is that this remarkable fellow fell into my care with a very large brain tumor that couldn't be managed in Ireland. His brother-in-law was one of the anesthesiologists at my hospital, and he asked me to evaluate and treat him. His surgery was successful, but he needed a lot of post-operative care that was difficult to get in Ireland. I had to get there to consult with his care team. I also saw this as an opportunity to test the long-range capabilities of the LongEZ while consulting with his doctors there. Meanwhile, Jerry's LongEZ partner in his build of the EZ, Gene Scott, had discussed flying their EZ over the pond to Germany for months. He had very often talked about his adventures in Europe during his long military career with his wife Nancy, and he wanted to revisit those memories with her. Jerry had an almost brand new Cessna Skylane 182 that he also flew. He and Gene later discussed the possibility of Gene flying his EZ with me to Ireland and then to Germany. They came to the conclusion that with the high risks involved, Gene should consider flying the Skylane if he really wanted to make the trip, rather than risking so many years of hard work in the building of 6 November Golf, their beloved easy flying machine. Gene was disappointed, but he understood, and he was grateful for Jerry's offer to use the Skylane. After many deliberations with Nancy, his wife, they decided to plan for the trip during his summer break at Miramar College, where he was teaching. I had already been busy making preparation for coverage of my practice and plans for the trip. So Gene came to me, knowing pretty well that I had my heart set on making the trip, and said, "Well, let's do it together." And I was elated. Well, there wasn't a great deal of time for planning, but we spent many days and nights putting things together. We had calls to the FAA and to Canada, discussions with pilots who had already made the trip, consulting with Jeppesen and gathering charts, obtaining information from AOPA, calling embassies, you name it. One important chore, though, almost causing the cancellation of all of our plans, was the requirement for HF communication. Gene had an ADF in his Skylane, but I couldn't use it in the EZ because I had no ground plane in this glass aircraft. So I bought a portable HF ICOM transceiver that I installed in the right strake with a tunable antenna, since I couldn't use a long wire with a pusher prop. I installed an Apollo Loran receiver with an antenna in my winglet. And pretty soon we were ready to go. Ed insisted that I have a Charger football logo on the winglets, and I added that with later an American flag decal. Just at the end of June, we took off from Gillespie Field in great weather VFR. We made a bunch of stops en route across the country, mostly VFR, testing maximum and minimum airspeeds, endurance hours, the capability of the new canard and rain, checking the engine frequently during the stops, etc. We had a first problem nearing Beverly Airport in Boston when the weather closed in, requiring a pop-up approach in IMC. Not in the LongEZ, but in the 182. Gene's compass was way off, and he had to do 2 missed approaches before he located the trouble. We had to get money exchanged for the Danish krone. We got Irish pounds, and we had arranged for a full weather briefing and tour of a contract international weather facility there in Boston. But actually, we spent most of the day looking for a brass compass screwdriver at several hardware stores. He swung the compass and noted to be almost 12 degrees out. We checked mine also, and the sign-off earlier had required compass correction cards, and mine was within limits. We had an uneventful flight to Moncton, New Brunswick in Canada. We had arranged to meet the Transport Canada agent, Marty Plumstead, for international flight briefing. Marty was a fantastic fund of knowledge, and I took copious notes during the almost full day he spent with us. He inspected both airplanes and wanted to know how well the HF worked. I said it worked, but I didn't tell him that the only contact I was able to make across the United States was with 2 ham operators. Moncton was closed in with fog that evening, and we spent an extra day there, especially enjoying the tides at the Bay of Fundy. Marty noted that we couldn't be released across the Atlantic without survival suits and a raft for each aircraft. Wow. But he helped us contact a rental agent in Halifax who promised our gear would be ready in Goose Bay. Our next leg took us directly to Goose Bay, Labrador. We got our first reaming out by ATC for flying over an active military gun and cannon range. There were more problems later. Coming into Goose Bay, the military controller there asked if I would accommodate him for a practice PAR approach, since he had never done one with a small experimental aircraft. Boy, would I? I hadn't either, and I was thrilled and wished I had one from any IMC approach after that. Goose Bay is a sprawling, combined civilian and military airport with then every modern facility you could think of in that remote area. As had been promised by the Halifax distributor, our gear was waiting. Now, where are we going to stow it? Gene had room for his raft, but I was already tight with a small suitcase and loads of charts in the rear seat. I had to get rid of most of the charts and stuff I thought I wouldn't absolutely need, and was able to cram the raft in, watching that the rear stick was free. Goose Bay was our last stop before the pond, so we spent a lot of time with the controllers and flight service before our plan to leave on the following day. They had a routine for newbies, and we were glad to participate. This is where we found that we didn't have all of the permits and paperwork, especially for an experimental plane. Then we learned firsthand the rule, better to beg forgiveness than ask permission. The paperwork was immense for official flight planning, and everywhere we stopped there was a careful attention to weather reports and flight path documentations. We put on our suits and took off just after calling Narsarsuaq Airport for their actual weather at that time. Nancy had an eagle eye and would often radio me to quit looking at my charts because she noted I was dropping off on one wing. We passed the time telling jokes and stories while flying VFR at 5,000 feet. There wasn't a heck of a lot to see, icebergs and water, but I can't say the flight was boring, looking always at the flight instruments and the wobbly compass I had. Now, if you were expecting a travelogue about the sights and scenery, you're going to be disappointed. I didn't have any GoPro or any fantastic cameras. I'd recommend you check out a YouTube by Hermann Schiele of Mannheim, Germany. We posted a phenomenal video of his exceptional airmanship and the Greenland environment just this year. And I have no such photos or videos to show you, but it's very much the stuff I saw when I went there. I'm just going to tell you about the incidents that we had on this trip and some of the events that were part of it. Our plan was to fly straight from Goose Bay to Narsarsuaq Airport with an alternate at Gotthab. It's now called Nuuk, the capital on the west coast, and that was 250 nautical miles to the north and just enough fuel for Gene as an alternate with almost no reserve. It was a clear day with a few clouds high above, and although we saw a lot of icebergs, we passed no ships at all. The water seemed very calm and was only disturbed by the icebergs that we saw. Julianhabe, now Quackertalk, was our initial waypoint. It had an NDB, and we were directed to use it to go there and then fly some 32 nautical miles at a heading of 80 degrees. We were warned of the variation of the compass so quickly at that far north, and to the airport at the end of a fjord. I didn't have the ADF, and Gene did, so we had to fly pretty closely together. Just as an aside, Narsarsuaq is now reported to be among the 10 most dangerous airports in the world. We didn't know it then. About 200 miles west of Greenland, the fun began. The beautiful day when we left turned cloudy with a layer above and a layer below at our steady 5,000 feet. Actually, we were at 5,500 feet because it was VFR. As we got about 100 miles west of Greenland, the layers were closing. We weren't about to turn back to as close to land, so Gene and I agreed to dip down to the lower level of 1,000 feet, and if we weren't clear of clouds, to climb back up to 5,500. We decided to diverge so as not to run into each other. Gene 10 degrees north and I 10 degrees south. I emerged from the clouds at about 3,000 feet, and I looked around for Gene, but no joy. Nancy, as great as her vision was, could not find me. I turned 10 degrees north and continued my search, and he 10 degrees south. At just about that time, I noted that the displays on my instrument panel were slowly growing dark, one by one, until I had none at all, but the whiskey compass. My transceiver was dead, so I tried my Terra handheld, and I fortunately got Gene. We had agreed previously that there would be no circling in any event that happened over the water, but to continue straight ahead. After a bit, my battery in the radio was weakening, and I communicating with one transmit key for yes and two for no until the handheld went completely dead. I flew our normal heading until this is all I saw. I climbed up to 5,500 feet now that the cloud layer overhead was gone. I had no sectional chart for this area, only an IFR chart. And I didn't know whether it was north or south of Julianhob or Quackertock. With plenty of fuel, I decided to fly south to Cape Farewell and then use time, speed, and distance along the shore until I would recognize the big city. All I saw were picturesque little towns with no airports, and the only flat spots were soccer fields and playgrounds, certainly nothing I could land on. I saw nothing that looked like a bigger city, and decided to fly north to the ice cap and then turn around and look for the largest town I could find along the coast. About where I thought Julianhob should be, I noticed a boat on the fjord and a tower on a hill nearby. That's got to be it. So as instructed by the guys at Goose Bay, I flew 3 fjords south and turned inland. The fjord ran out into a blind canyon. I climbed over it, and this is all I saw. What do I do now? I still had a couple of hours of fuel, so I could go back to Julianhob. And while trying to decide whether I should land on the ice cap or try something at Julianhob, I saw way in the distance to the north a small column of smoke. Well, I felt where there's smoke, there must be people, so I headed for it, and in a short time, there was the Narsarsuaq airport. Gene and Nancy had landed safely, but after I hadn't appeared for hours, he went to the tower and declared an emergency. When I landed, the helicopters were just starting to leave, so they aborted, and I thanked the powers that be. Tuesdays, which was that day, were the only days that Narsarsuaq burned their garbage. This is one of the rotorcraft that were wheeled back into the hangar while I removed the cowls on the LongEZ. While Gene and the A&P there at Greenland Narsarsuaq watched, I found that I had been too careful wiring the alternator. I had swaged the spade field contact to the connector and then soldered it. The vibration had broken the wire. But why did I wait until I was over the Atlantic? It was an easy fix, but an almost lethal error. Relieved, we went to the airport hotel and had dinner and were assigned to our cells for sleep prior to departure the next day. Our next stop was Reykjavik, Iceland. We went through the usual accustomed flight planning and weather charting. We paid our bills and we were ready to go. I was pushing for IFR this time over the ice cap, but Gene wanted to stay lower than the required 13,000 feet to get over the ice cap and stay VFR around the coast to Cape Farewell and then across to Iceland. He was concerned that he might get a migraine at those altitudes. He didn't have any extra oxygen aboard either. So we took off down what was now a familiar coast to me. We got down to the Cape Farewell turn, and Gene noted the headwinds there had picked up severely, and that was the reason for the name, I guess. And he calculated that our ground speed at less than 90 knots wouldn't allow him fuel to make Reykjavik. So we had to turn around. By that time, the weather at Narsarsuaq had deteriorated to overcast with sleet and icing and winds at 20 knots, gusting to 40. The tower changed runways on our approach, with the windsock spinning like a rotor. Gene used 20 degrees of flaps on landing, and the flaps froze in the down position, so he couldn't go around. I saw him bounce down the runway to a stop, and then it was my turn. Three attempts led to the decision to do a carrier-type landing at high speed in a stiff crosswind. The LongEZ is rated at a maximum 20-knot crosswind. I plopped onto the runway with a collapsed nose gear and slid down the runway to a stop. I exited the airplane quickly, and I held onto the canopy, which was being blown in the wind, and quickly closing it after me to hold down the wing that was lifting in the wind. After some time, Gene came back with a pickup truck, and I rode on the nose in the bed of the pickup truck to get to the hangar where the doors were flapping crazily. Once there, I removed the nose gear to find it had snapped across the aluminum gear housing. Days to weeks for a replacement to come, the A&P there graciously offered to do the unguaranteed TIG welding repair that night while we returned to the hotel. That night, while Gene, Nancy, and I were in the dining room, silent after the events of that day, Gene announced that he and Nancy decided to leave the 182 and go commercial from then on, and come back after the trip to pick it up and fly home. That was a real shock to me. And I was quiet for some time before I told them that I'd be continuing on alone. Nancy told me later that she thought she'd never see me again. It took most of the morning to assemble the now repaired gear assembly and to do all the flight plans and bill paying before I could leave. This time I did go IFR over the ice cap directly to Reykjavik. I found my handwritten notes that I had made 35 years ago while I was in the flight service office there. All the notes that had to get VFR at 195 degrees and the transition altitude was 6,000 feet, at which we went to 2992 on the gold, and all the frequencies and everything else I had to use. I decided I had more than enough fuel to go directly to Iceland since it was getting later in the long day. During the flight, I was contacted by an airliner above, and I was surprised to hear Gene's voice wishing me well and hoping to get together when he arrived at Keflavik, but that never happened because I went to Reykjavik. En route, I had to report my position from time to time, asking the commercial airlines to relay. They all did that without question except one time. I contacted a TW flight overhead using 27.9 frequency and gave him my lat-long expected time of next report, fuel and souls aboard, etc. He came back with, "Let me get this straight. You are a single-engined experimental aircraft at this and this lat-long flying solo over the Atlantic?" I responded in the affirmative, and he came back with, "Let me tell you this, buddy, you are lost." I thanked him for the relay and assured him that it wasn't, with a laugh. Reykjavik is a beautiful city, and the lineman was just great. He was pushing back onlookers and guiding me to the far corner of a large hangar. I spent that day and all the next touring, and then took off for Stornoway, Scotland, next leg. This was the longest leg so far, but the weather was good when departing, and I was used to the communications now. About 100 miles south of Iceland, though, my engine slowly lost RPM and coughed a couple of times. I had nowhere to go, and all I saw down below were the icebergs, one flat enough but not long enough to land on. I did all of the automatic things. I switched tanks, fuel pump on, mixture rich, and went over the ditching and raft instructions. It was clear air, but I thought I might just as well try carb heat, and immediately the engine smoothed out and I relaxed. I couldn't imagine carb ice with no visible moisture, but it was very cold and maybe there was some water in the BP fuel. Who knows? Nevertheless, I kept my carb heat on and my speed went down about 10 knots for the duration. I got about 100 miles or more to Stornoway, and I noted a green haze way off to the right, and I said to myself, that must be Ireland. As usual, the weather changed, and the Stornoway FIR advised me that the airport was now low IFR and was about to close at 5 p.m. I could hardly understand the controller with his thick Scottish accent, and I asked if he were speaking English. He slowed down, and I requested deviation direct Shannon in Ireland, and that was approved. Coming up to 8 hours in the air, I slowed to 140 knots for fuel conservation. I turned off the carb heat then, and I was soon over the green fields of Ireland. Gene was there to meet me, having been to the tower and hobnobbing with his controllers, monitoring my flight. 8 hours and 1 minute from Reykjavik. My bladder was so full I couldn't see. The Irish crowd was there to welcome me, and I spent the next week in a whirlwind tour of the best places. And doing what I had set out to do, making certain that the care for Derry was set up as it should be. Too soon it was time to pack. A difficult job with all of the gifts, including some fine crystalware and 5 bottles of Tullamore Dew that my wife loved. Shannon was no different from all the other stops, and the planning and weather were drummed into me. From Shannon Airport back to Iceland via a few turns around Derry's town, Shannonbridge, with sheets waving and large signs wishing me well, over to Achill Head, the last VOR in Ireland, and back to Loran for navigation. The winds were at my back, and only when I saw the dormant Iceland volcano far in the distance did I breathe easily. But the weather in southern Iceland had deteriorated, and I was IMC. Keflavik Control gave me a hard time for being off course until they realized I was really bound for Reykjavik and an experimental plane. They vectored me to an approach course and down through the clouds where I experienced my first icing. Quickly in VMC, and then it sublimed. Only overnight at the Loftleader Hotel at the airport, and then off to Greenland. Jean and Nancy took a commercial flight from Hamburg, and then from Keflavik they used Greenland Air to Narsarsuaq. They planned to pick up the 182 Skylane and fly to Godhaab, now Nuuk, sightsee a bit, and wait for me to go together to Canada. My flight plan was to land at Kulusuk Island, refuel, and then direct to Godhaab over the ice cap at 12,000 feet IFR. Kulusuk Island was overcast and, as usual, having a weather change. At that time, it was also a gravel runway, and with a pressure prop, bad weather, and that type of runway, I decided to fly directly to Nuuk, Godhaab, over the ice cap. The dew line was set up as a radar defense against any military flights from Russia over the pole. As I flew over Kulusuk, I was asked to relay to Sanderstum FIR that a Danish military aircraft had just left and to give his position report. I complied, happy to return the favors I had received previously. The reporting stations en route were those of the dew line, and I contacted each one in turn, from Big Gun to Sob Story and later Sea Bass. The overcast at Kulusuk continued on my flight west. I was contacted by Sob Story that their radar had me at 11,600 feet, and would I please correct? It was very cold, and I had no heater in the plane, wearing a wool shirt and a wool sweater under my survival suit. Also, I wasn't happy with the sound of the engine at that altitude, so I dropped down, just skimming over the tops of the cloud layer. I explained this and asked if there were any other traffic nearby. They noted that there was not, and that the only other traffic had been the Danish aircraft that I relayed for them previously. Nevertheless, they persisted in asking that I climb to 12,000 feet. In addition, they asked that I circle the station just a few miles off course so that the crew could see my plane that they knew nothing about. I explained that it would be of no use since I was above the clouds and they wouldn't be able to see me. There was silence for quite a while, but he came back asking me to confirm my coordinates, and I did. Again, he said, "But sir, the sun is shining all over the ice cap here." Then I realized it wasn't the clouds I was skimming over, but the ice cap itself that had imperceptibly merged with the cloud layer without my being aware. I climbed to 12,000 feet immediately and told him I couldn't circle because of fuel concerns. My feet were actually frozen, so I couldn't feel them, and I didn't want to take the extra time. I'm sorry now that I didn't, with all the help that they gave me. Then they told me that Godhaab was reporting weather below approach limits and what were my intentions. I checked the charts. I certainly wouldn't go back down to Narsarsuaq with their weather history. So I told them I'd like to divert to Sanderstum Airport, and they approved. By the time I arrived at the U.S. Air Force Combined Base Airport at Sanderstum, I was really chilled. And the landing I made there with no feeling in my feet prompted the tower controller to state that he had never seen a landing like that. He wanted to know about the airplane, so I invited the tower crew and later the manager of the airport and his wife to have dinner with me at the officers' mess on the U.S. Air Force side. They had never been invited before, so we had a great time, my explaining the LongEZ, and they laughingly noted that Gene's plane company, where he was flying from Hamburg, or rather from Keflavik to Narsarsuaq, Greenland Air, they used for parts for theirs when they went down on the cap. I spent 3 days there waiting for Gene to call that he was in Godhaab. Turned out that they had to turn back to Keflavik 3 times because of the weather at Narsarsuaq. During that time, I changed the oil in the plugs and put a temporary clamp on the front wheel that I had broken during that landing. I had planned my trip to Canada to meet Jean and Nancy at Iqaluit in the Northwest Territories, passing over the Davis Strait to Cape Dyer, and I had to do a VORDME approach because of weather. Leaving Sanderstrom then with a thin overcast, I flew down the fjord just above the water at max speed and pulled up quickly to get through that layer. When I broke through to the sun, my canopy was completely occluded by ice, and that fortunately sublimed in minutes when I got into the sunshine. Iqaluit was a frontier town then, and I enjoyed the environment while waiting for Jean and Nancy to arrive the following day. After we joined, we flew to Kuujjuaq, La Grande Riviere over the bay, and stayed overnight in Capus Casing, known for paper pulp. They made it in giant rolls of paper for the New York Times, and that pulp really smelled bad. We stopped at a motel where the girl at the desk asked how many rooms. We said 2, and the girl looked puzzled. Nancy, a typical Navy CWO's wife, looked at both of us and said, "I don't know, guys. Who am I sleeping with tonight?" I quickly explained that they were married and in the Navy too long, and the girl's flush disappeared very quickly. At International Falls, for the U.S. Entry Customs check, there was a problem. I had declared the 5 bottles of Tullamore Dew, and he wouldn't allow it, limiting it to 1 bottle. But he became interested in the plane, and during my discussion all about it, he forgot. We flew to Norfolk, Nebraska after that, where Jerry's parents lived. And en route, I heard a loud noise from the engine compartment. I had an automotive alternator that I installed, and the fan portion broke, causing a continued scraping and screeching sound. We removed the alternator that had been damaged externally without possibility of repair, and replaced it with a used alternator that Jerry's dad fortunately found for us. As though that weren't enough, that alternator failed just close to Omaha, and I replaced it with a new aircraft type, one that I was able to get at the airport facility there at Omaha. Nancy left us to fly commercial to San Diego to meet her work requirements, and then Jean and I flew south. We ran into a bunch of thunderstorms in New Mexico, and we had to divert to Taos, where Jean suffered a migraine headache skirting around the towering cumulus. He was vomiting so severely I took him to a hospital ER, where the doctor believed he was an addict seeking narcotics. I had to show her my credentials, sharing the details of our trip, and I assured he wasn't. She gave him a shot of Demerol, and I took him back to his room where he slept off the effects. She said, "Don't come back." We stopped at Grand Canyon for fuel and got home about 4 hours later, where a group was waiting to hear all about our adventure. All I really had to show for that adventure was a bunch of decals and 5 bottles of Tullamore Dew. It was a very long trip with a smattering of excitement and many memories. About 90 hours of flight time and almost 12,000 miles, putting the LongEZ through a real assessment. Derry did very well and is a Grand Master bridge participant in Ireland, and remains an avid fisherman and proponent for his village of Shannonbridge. We visited him many times after that journey, always by commercial flight. At my 80th birthday, a friend made a model commemorating the fantastic Rutan airplane, and the opportunity to upgrade the plane, its engine, avionics, and airframe to where it is today. Because of my age, the insurance companies refused to renew liability coverage, so the plane now resides in the Rutan Aircraft Flying Experience, RAFE, in Houston, Texas. And I miss her.